Welcome to One Work, Five Questions with Donna Vitek, that is I, and Dr. Mark Holacek, that is the other guy.
The philosopher dude
The philosopher, oh my goodness.
is what
No,
my students called me one time.
the philosopher dude. Maybe a surfer. This is our 72nd episode of One Work, Five Questions. And before we get started, though, I want to give your credentials. That's my most favorite thing to do at the beginning of the show. Dr. Holacek is a professor of philosophy and history who has taught at institutions such as University of Pittsburgh, University of Michigan, Rutgers University, Camden, and Ohio University. And he has 27 published books, right? 27?
Yeah, I've
Okay.
got another done and more in the offing.
And 200 essays on Thomas Jefferson. Wow.
Plus,
Yes, and we're working on another. We have ideas for another book. So look out for be looking for the 28th book on Thomas Jefferson.
well, it'll probably be the 30th book because I have two others that are done that are not yet published. But yeah, we'll
Oh,
talk about that at the end of the show. We could bring that
okay.
up.
With our show One Work, Five Questions, I'll ask Dr. Holacek five questions on one work of Thomas Jefferson. And today's episode let me go back up to the top. Today's episode is on a letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote to William Short on October 31st, 1819. Thomas Jefferson, as Dr. Holacek has said on numerous occasions, was fundamentally a moralist. His granddaughter Ellen noted that he was seen with a book on ancient Greek and Roman moralists in his hand more than any other sort of book. We have in the past episodes talked about Thomas Jefferson's fascination with Jesus' system of morality. That was one of my favorite episodes. Yeah. Okay.
I've got
Here.
Cicero here.
Oh,
It's on
that'll be
duties.
another.
Jefferson, yeah,
That'll be
Jefferson.
another favorite. Cicero. Here, Thomas Jefferson tells William Short of his partiality for Epicurus. Was Thomas Jefferson really an Epicurean? In this episode, Dr. Holacek explains why Thomas Jefferson was and could never have been an Epicurean and why he was a Stoic. In this episode, we cover Thomas Jefferson's letter to Short, dated the 31st of October, 1819. I'm Donna Vitek, and this is One Work, Five Questions. Take episode 72.
There we go.
Yeah. Okay. Are you ready for question number
I
one?
am ready. Let's
Okay.
rock.
Question number one. As usual, and for the sake of our viewers, can you say something about William Short?
I'll make my answer short.
Oh, okay. Oh,
He
well, that's
was
new.
a short for short. He was Thomas Jefferson's secretary while Jefferson was in France,
Oh.
and he was. Give you some context. He was born in 1859, and he lived to be roughly 89, 90 years. He was born in. He died in. Um, excuse me. He was born in 1749. He died in 1849, so he lived roughly to be close to 90 years. He was an emissary. Like I said, he was Jefferson's secretary while in France, and he stayed on there to be an envoy to France on behalf of America. He also was an envoy to the Netherlands and to Spain as well. So I mean, we can just say that he was a close friend of Thomas Jefferson, and in some measures, it was 1859. Jefferson's 43, so there's a 16-year difference. Jefferson sort of looked upon him as a son in some sense. So they were very,
Yeah.
very close.
Yeah, that would be with the 16-year difference. Okay. The letter begins, as you like to say, with a sockdolager, Thomas Jefferson's avowal of kinship with Epicurus.
I
Can
like
you
that
tell
word,
us?
stockdolager.
Yeah.
I use it all the time, and like I said, I didn't even know how to pronounce it, but stockdolager. Yeah. So his kinship. So what does he say? He castigates. Short says, "As you say of yourself, I too am an Epicurean." Right? And he comes. Jefferson says, "Well." Um, I consider the genuine doctrines of Epicurus as containing everything rational in moral philosophy, which Greece and Rome has left us, right? Uh, he says the genuine, not the imputed, which is a very strange claim to make because Thomas Jefferson gets his view of Epicurus from Pierre Gassendi, who was a rough contemporary, lived before Jefferson. But Epicurus was, I think, 341 to 270 BC. I used to teach him all the time. I have a chapter in the book, not Conquest of Happiness, but Greeks on Happiness or something like that, one of my earliest books. And I have a chapter in Epicurus I wrote on him. The problem is that drawing from Pierre Gassendi's depiction of Epicurus gives us a false view of Epicurus. And Jefferson should have known that, right? Jefferson owned Diogenes Laertius, who talked about a lot of, and I have this, the Epicurus reader, and I taught Epicurus on many occasions. And Jefferson had Diogenes' account of Jefferson. He should have been able to use that. He preferred Gassendi's, but Gassendi gives us a stoicized and a Christianized Epicurus. Now, so the point is, one of my first papers ever published on Jefferson was a paper that shows that Jefferson was not an Epicurean, he was a Stoic, right? Now, who was Epicurus? Epicurus was an atomist, like Newton many, many centuries after him. Believed everything is made up of atoms. Atoms just means, in Greek, it means an uncuttable, something uncuttable. These fundamental particles, and Epicurus thought there were an infinite number of particles, but a finite number of kinds, right? You understand what I mean by that? If we have, of the number of types of particles that there are, they're infinite. Right. But the types are finite, which means that there's probably an infinite amount of each type, or at least an infinite amount of one type. I prefer the former, but he never tells us. So he thinks everything, I am just made up of atoms, and atoms are sort of wafting in the air, and they, in some sense, collide with each other. When they collide, they're variously formed. Imagine two hooks like this hooking up and locking together, and you get accidentally all the things that you see in the universe are things that are from accidental collisions of atoms. I am just an accidental creation from collisions of atoms, and so are you. Aristotle thought that view was insane, would have thought something like that was insane, because these things admit there's so much uniformity between you and me and other humans that it's hard to think that all these things could come about just by collisions. Not a very interesting, and he also thought that humans had free will because the atoms by their nature just fell in free space. They're heavy and heavy things fall. They fell in free space, but some of them would sometimes swerve. And when they swerved, that caused the collisions, and the collisions made them. And these accidental swerves, he thought, gave humans free will. Whatever that means, don't ask. It's
okay.
Just a very strange. Now, ethically speaking, what Epicurus gives us a very profoundly interesting view of how to live your life. We strove for, and Jefferson talks about this, we'll see in the last question, ataraxia, which meant mental equilibrium, internal equilibrium. And he tells us that the things that disturb us are both so Epicurus was about pleasure, Greek hedone. Hedone, we have the word hedonism from hedone.
Okay.
He meant we live for the sake of living pleasantly, of acquiring pleasure. But pleasure wasn't for him as it was for other hedonists who thought, the idea is if I'm hungry, I just go out to Burger King and get myself a couple Whoppers and fries. If I feel like getting happy, I'll go ahead and get drunk. If I have a hangover, doesn't feel good, I'll just get drunk again. And if I need money, I'll beat somebody up and steal their money. It's just the point is, I just want to. That was the wrong sort of pleasure. Epicurus thought we arrive at pleasure when we calm the internal physical disturbances of the body. When I'm hungry, that's something physical. My stomach is gurgling. What I do need is water and bread. I don't need caviar and fine wine.
Right, right.
In fact, if I eat too much caviar, drink too much fine wine, I'm probably going to feel worse than I felt when I was hungry. So Epicurus is all about just minifying or eliminating the physical disturbances to my body. When I'm tired, I sleep. When I'm hungry, I eat, simple foods that won't disturb my
Mm,
body. If I'm thirsty, I drink.
right.
What does Epicurus mean to us today? You
What
know,
does he mean to us today? No.
well, when you call someone an Epicurean, the way it's usually meant, what does it mean? Right? We use the term Epicurean to mean someone who's fond of fine wines, good foods, tasty
Oh, right.
things.
What we just, yeah,
But
what we
that's not
just read.
Epicurus. Epicurus never
Right.
says any of that. But he's also famous for telling us that the disturbances of the mind are much greater than the disturbances of the body. Now, clearly,
Wow.
if someone cuts off my hand, that's going to hurt. But it's
Right.
going to hurt only insofar as, in some time it'll heal and then the pain will go away. It might take a while. But the disturbances of the soul stay with us for a very long time, right? If,
Right.
if, if I believe that someone's out to get me, everywhere I go, I feel people are after me. That's going to bother me day in and cause me to not sleep well and all sorts of things,
Right.
right? If I have a guilty conscience from some bad deeds, I'm worried about that all the time. So it disturbs my soul. These disturbances of the soul bother me. Now, there are three things about which we form false views, says Epicurus, that disturb our soul more. The false view of the gods. He doesn't believe in a God that created the universe. Gods were created too. Gods were formed by
Right.
the collisions of atoms, but the collisions of atoms in the cases of the gods are so tight that they don't fall apart. Humans die because the atoms, at some sense, I'm being bombarded by other atoms right now, and at some point it just overwhelms me and I die and I decay. The gods, no. The gods have atoms that fit so well together that they don't decay. Now, the gods,
Oh,
Epicurus tells us, live in the intermundia, in the space. There's an infinite number of worlds, and the gods live between the worlds. The gods are unconcerned with human affairs. Why is that important? Because all the views that we get in Greek times about Zeus and his father Kronos and his father Saturn and all that, to throw in some Latin term, uh, these gods are continually involving themselves in humans' affairs. So the Greeks would sacrifice to the gods and offer up things to the gods, so the gods would treat them kindly or not harm them. Hesiod, the great writer, just after Homer, always talked about, you offer up offerings to the gods just so they won't damn you and harm you. But if
right.
you do, that doesn't mean that they won't, you know. But it's something that might help. So the view that the gods involve themselves in human affairs gives us disturbances and disturbs our soul. Forget it. The gods don't care about us. We're imperfect beings. They're involved with things not so imperfect. Second thing, I'll say the last two quickly. False view of death. Death just means the cessation of life. There's no afterlife. There's no punishment, no reward. Once we come to view, people are afraid to die and afraid of death because they think that there's some punishment or something coming. He says, Lucretius, his disciple, says, you see yourself laying dead outside of yourself, seeing yourself as dead. You lament that. He goes, get rid of that. You're just dead. You're not going to see yourself. You're just
Right.
dead. It's a view
Right.
I find very attractive. It's a view I think makes sense to me. And then lastly, and most importantly, is the false view of pleasures and pains. He thinks that we can roughly completely eliminate roughly completely eliminate disturbances of the bodies by when I'm hungry, I just take in simple bread. And I'm thirsty, I drink water, right? And I take care of that and I do it in moderation, right? And that in that way, there is a limit to pleasure.
Mm-hmm.
Pleasure is when I'm completely sated. If I'm hungry and I take in just enough bread and I'm thirsty, just enough water to slake my thirst and sate my hunger, I'm fine. I feel good. I don't feel any pain. If I eat too much, I feel bad. So he's not about, fancy food, fancy sex. He's not about any of that stuff. If that stuff's going to disturb your soul, live simply for Epicurus. There's a limit to pleasure. The problem is that when people have the positive view of pleasure, that if I'm hungry, I'm going to go out and eat fancy food, right? I'm going to have caviar. I have some caviar, it tastes great. What do I do then? After I have some caviar, it tastes great. I have more. What do
Yeah.
I do after that tastes great?
You have more.
I have more and more and more. And then all of a sudden you feel terrible,
Yeah.
right? Because we tend to think that if something tastes good and it's tasty, the more of it I have, the better I'm going to feel without realizing that just doesn't.
Right.
So this whole notion is he talks about kinship and one other thing. So Gassendi's Epicurus talks of God not being physical. Epicurus' God is physical. So he's looking at a depiction of Epicurus that's not completely false, but in some sense false. Um, so we have certain problems with drawing from Gassendi for the Epicurus that Jefferson says. So he says, I'm a disciple of Epicurus. He's a disciple of Gassendi's Epicurus. If he really reads Epicurus that Diogenes preserves for us, right? We find out that he really wasn't an Epicurean, right? Um,
Okay.
that much I can say.
Okay. Question number 3. Thomas Jefferson briefly discusses and dismisses the philosophers Epictetus,
Yeah,
Plato,
we say Epictetus. He's a Greek.
Epictetus, Plato, Socrates, Seneca, and Jesus. What are the defects of those philosophers' ethical systems?
I'll try to cover this a little bit more quickly. Epictetus was a former slave who was freed from his slavery and became a famous philosopher. And he wrote 4 books on philosophy, as well as some called the Enchiridion. And so he's a Stoic. He says, Epictetus has given us what was good of the Stoics, all beyond of their dogmas being hypocrisy and grimace. Their great crime was in their calumnies of Epicurus and misrepresentations of his doctrines, right? In many respects, I think this is really off Jefferson because I have argued in my book, Thomas Jefferson Moralist, Jefferson was a Stoic, not an Epicurean. Jefferson was an Epicurean in his cosmology because he was an atomist. He believed all things were atoms. And he had a cosmology that was similar. It was Newtonian, but similar to Epicurus. But in morality, he wasn't. One of the big differences, for example, the Stoics always tell us we need to be civically engaged. The Stoic philosophy Hierocles says we have our first responsibility to ourselves, then to our immediate family. I would have, say, my wife, my children, then to my parents, brothers, sisters, then to aunts and uncles, then to people in Greek times in my deme, then to people, in Greece, then to people elsewhere in the world. So there are these layers of responsibility, the first of which is myself. Aristotle would agree with that because if I don't take care of myself first, I can't take care of anybody else. So the idea is the Stoics believe in civic responsibility. The Epicureans you see in the background here, that is Epicurus's garden outside of Athens. Epicurus
Ah,
asked for people to withdraw politically, get uninvolved in political affairs. Was Jefferson uninvolved in political affairs?
no.
No, he was not an Epicurean. He has this garden outside. Why does he advocate withdrawal from political affairs? Because you get yourself worked up. You get yourself tense. You start arguing with other people who don't share your views. You get angry and you don't have peace
Right.
of mind. Forget politics. Jefferson
Right.
was not an Epicurean. That alone, the fact that Jefferson was so politically involved, shows he was no Epicurean. Now he goes to Plato. Jefferson expressed great execration, great hatred of Plato, not because his political or ethical views were so bad, but because he gives us the tripartite soul. He says we have a rational soul. Each person has a rational soul, an appetitive soul, and a spirited or courageous soul, right? And if I'm thinking and doing arithmetic, I'm using my rational soul. But he also saw that those three souls corresponded to three types of people in any sort of polis, city state. You have the rulers, who are predominantly rational, the policemen and soldiers, who are courageous, with the courageous soul, and then the laborers, who work by appetite, right? Interested in whetting their appetites all the time. Jefferson hated this because he thought this notion of the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, which he abhorred, was really drawing from Plato. It was Neoplatonism that got into Christian thinking, and I think this is probably right. He hated this notion of the Trinity. He just says that this notion of three gods in one makes no sense. That's why he hated Plato. Now, Socrates, he says, well, we know nothing about Socrates because the Socrates that Plato gives us is corrupted, and we only have Xenophon's. There's only three people that talk about Socrates: Plato, Xenophon, and Aristotle. And Aristotle says very little. Plato and Xenophon give us sort of depictions of Socrates, and I taught Socrates and Plato on numerous occasions. He just says, well, we don't really know who Socrates was. Then he talks about Seneca, who's a more modern Stoic, right? Time of Christ. He says he's indeed a fine moralist, disfiguring his work at times with some stoicism. He was a Stoic, and affecting too much of antithesis in point, yet giving us on the whole a great deal of sound and practical morality. Right. So he was a Stoic thinker. Jefferson doesn't consider him one, but he was. And he thinks, well, he gave us a lot of great stuff. Then he points to Jesus. We talked to Jesus. I strained for a long time trying to figure out why he figured Jesus was greater than all these other philosophers. Now, notice here he doesn't say Jesus is better than Epicurus, right? In other places, he does. He just says Jesus was the greatest. He says Epictetus and Epicurus give us laws for governing ourselves. Jesus, a supplement of the duties and charities we owe others. That, in a nutshell, is the reason why Jesus' teachings are superior. Because the Greeks give us laws like Epicurus gives us for handling disturbances in my soul. I can calm myself. I'm not going to be, I withdraw to the garden and live a pleasant life and don't get worked up. But that's not what Jesus taught us. Jesus said you leave the garden, you get involved in affairs, you help, charity, benevolence, love of other people. That's why Jefferson preferred Jesus's teachings. So he thought all of these, in some measure, probably with the exception of Jesus, maybe he might have, it never says this anywhere, he might have conceded that Jesus could have said more about loving yourself as well as loving others. Jefferson never says that. But all of these views are in some measure defective, perhaps with the exception of Jesus's views, because Jesus taught benevolence. Did that get you somewhere? Did that answer the question? I hope.
Yes, it did. It did. Um, I would so love to do more on the individual Greek philosophers, how they influenced Jefferson. So
We
that may be
can. I
coming
mean,
up.
it's
That may be coming up in one of our
yeah,
future episodes.
we can.
Okay.
I'm trying to show here was not an Epicurean, regardless of what he said. My
Yeah.
strongest argument is Epicurus preached withdrawal from human affairs because when humans get politically involved,
Yeah.
you get away from ataraxia.
Yeah.
Your soul is disturbed by all sorts of political
Well, you don't have to answer this now, but what I'd like to know at some point, if we do some episodes, different episodes on the philosophers, which one had the greatest influence on Thomas Jefferson?
I don't know if I can answer that. I
Wow.
think
Okay,
he
that's
was. I would. At this point, this is a really good question. I think he talked about Jesus. I don't think Jesus had the greatest effect on him. I think probably Cicero,
oh
who
well
was who
that
was not a Stoic. He was not an. He was an eclectic, which means he drew from many different sources. But Cicero had remarkable and marked Stoic leanings. He was drawn to the Stoics in many respects, even though he never commits to the Stoics. He's
oh I
drawn
would
to
I
them. He
I'm
writes a
so
lot about them.
excited to I'm looking forward to doing stuff on the I just
Well,
I've always
I showed you, I'm looking at Cicero's On Duties, De Officiis again, and I used to teach this. And, you mentioned already that his granddaughter Ellen always saw him with a book like that in his hand more than any other book. Uh, when you read stuff like that, there's so much worth pondering, worth mulling over. It's chilling at times just how beautiful some of these thoughts are. And Cicero's On Duty is just a remarkable. And
when I was taking my Florida Civic Seal of Excellence course, that's when I was exposed to a lot of Cicero and his influence on the founders, and that was I have to say he was my favorite of all of the of all the the Greek influences. So
oh, there's so
I'm
much to
looking forward
read.
to our next one of
I'm
our
reading
future episodes.
right now Cicero on Orators. And again, that doesn't do much for us. When I taught this stuff, I was never that attracted to that because there wasn't the philosophical content so much, in terms of how to speak persuasively. But I'm reading it now because that was a very important work in Jefferson's day. And public speaking Jefferson was very bad at it, but Jefferson read, Cicero's on orators and so forth, and just about everybody did at the time. You're expected to read that, and it gives you sort of a blueprint for how to speak effectively. And one of the things he says, I'll be brief on one thing he says, before you can even think about speaking beautifully and effectively, you have to know just about everything. And Jefferson says the same thing when practicing law. Good lawyer knows everything.
Oh boy, yeah. Question number 4. He goes on lengthily to discuss the philosophy of Jesus. Does he not elsewhere admit that Jesus was the greatest philosopher? If so, why the paean to Epicurus here?
I don't know if I can answer that. I'm always puzzled by this stuff, by his, you know, Jefferson in another letter says, I'm not a Stoic. The Stoics get everything. He is a Stoic. Stoics preached involvement. They preached, they talked about the four virtues that about which Plato talked. Instead of wisdom, um, the Stoics advocated practical wisdom instead of wisdom. So there's that difference. But yeah, I don't know why he's so intent to consider himself an Epicurean, because Jefferson does make a commitment to atomism in a letter to John Adams, after retirement. So he is interested in atomism, and Epicurus was an atomist, but Epicurus thought there were a number of gods, and these gods didn't create the world. They were created by the atoms colliding. And that's not what Jefferson thinks. So it's very, very strange why he thinks, that Epicureanism is such a moving thing. He doesn't even get Epicurus right. Like I said, one of my earliest published papers was on Jefferson Epicurus. His cosmology is Epicurean, atoms moving around in void, just like Isaac Newton. But his ethics is certainly not Epicurean. So Jefferson is ever committed to Jesus being the greatest moralist, at least the greatest reformer of the misinformed morality or ethical code of the Jews. By the way, when we use the terms morality and ethics, the ancients would have been more interested in ethics. Morality is a word we use recently, more recently, comes up in Jefferson's day, that points us in the direction for what do I do in such and such situation? What is a morally correct action? Whereas ethics is something broader. It's how do I live every day to be a good person? When someone's talking about morality, I'm just talking about in a situation, what's the correct action? The question of, presumably, if I keep doing the correct thing, I'm a good person. But the idea behind ethical thinking is living, as Epicurus say, living in such a way where I don't eat large quantities of really tasty stuff and so forth. So I dodged your question, but I'm sort of confused why he was so open about his love of Epicurus, because he wasn't an Epicurean.
I'm used to you dodging my questions.
Well,
Question
I'm
number
not really
5.
dodging it. It's just that I think Jefferson is sort of confused on that. He's not confused that often, but he is here.
Finally, any comments on the enclosed syllabus, which is a synopsis of Epicureanism?
Well, yeah, I mean, we can, on the share screen, I'll try to bring up his syllabus if I have here. No, don't have it. Let me see if I thought I had it up on my thing. But I mean, I'd like to be able to bring up his syllabus here. Do I have it? Yeah, I have it here. Hold on. So I'd like the viewers to be able to look at this. I hope it comes up. Here we go. Let me bring it up on share screen and we'll be ready to rock. Here we go. All right, you can see that. Huh? So this is what he writes for the doctrines of Epicurus. On the physical side, the universe is eternal. Epicurus says that. Its parts great and small, interchangeable. I'm not sure what Jefferson means by that. Epicurus thought all things were made up of atoms in void space, and atoms could not be broken down. They're uncuttables. They're things that were the smallest type of particles. But, all the things that are made of atoms will break down at some point, except the gods. There's matter and void alone, and that's what Epicurus says. Motion inherent in matter, which is weighty. Yeah, Epicurus says, look, atoms fall because of their weight, and then they swerve. When they swerve, they collide, and then they form compound bodies, and those bodies will decay in time. Eternal circulation. Epicurus doesn't talk about circulation. He talks about falling and swerving. So he gets that wrong. He says the gods, in order of beings next superior to man, enjoying in their sphere their own felicities, but not meddling. That's correct. Epicurus said the gods live between the universes. There were infinite number of universes for Epicurus. The universe was infinite, and in the universe, an infinite number of worlds, right? And the gods lived between those worlds, and they did not care. Again, how do you call yourself an Epicurean if Jefferson thinks that God created the world, right? That the world was created in time. And Epicurus didn't think so. Now, his ethical views. Happiness is the aim of life. Epicurus doesn't say that. Epicurus says ataraxia, living in such a way where I dispel pain, get rid of pain. Pleasure is not going out and seeking pleasurable things. It's removing pain. If I have pain, if I can remove it, that's what pleasure is, right? It's not eating a bucket of chicken and drinking a gallon of beer. That's what I consider pleasure. Just teasing. Okay, virtue is the foundation of happiness. Again, Epicurus really doesn't say that. He's interested in ataraxia, removing pain, in stabilizing your soul, calming your soul. What does it mean? The soul for him, for Epicurus, is physical. What does it mean to calm the soul? Think of it just like working out. Think about someone with high blood pressure really physically in bad shape, you start working out, and all of a sudden your blood pressure goes down, your heartbeat is normal, you feel better. Same thing if you act in such a way, you avoid fears and doubts and hopes, right? You don't worry about the gods intervening, you don't worry about death. And that's what he means by ataraxia. Indolence, ataraxia. That's a bad translation for indolence means sort of like laziness, inactivity. Ataraxia is more stability of soul through living calmly. Absence of hunger is the article of felicity. Eating the means to obtain it. That's correct, but we don't eat simple foods. The summum bonum is not to be pained in body. That's correct. Nor troubled in mind. That's correct. And Epicurus thought being untroubled in mind is more important than being untroubled in body. Ataraxia or indolence, laziness, tranquility of mind. To procure ataraxia of mind, ataraxia, tranquility of mind. We must avoid desire, fear. That's fine. Man is a free agent. Epicurus says that. We have free will. He thinks because of the atom swerving, however that works. I've never been able to understand that, because the particles that make up us, in some sense, swerve in space arbitrarily without a cause. That gives us free will. That's a very strange and weird argument. Okay, so man is free. Epicurus says that. There is virtue, prudence, temperance, fortitude, and justice, and vice. We want to avoid folly, desire, fear, and deceit. Jefferson's own spelling of deceit. The I before E except after C and all that. But anyways, Epicurus was not interested in the virtues per se. Virtues, like for Aristotle, Plato, and Stoics, were ends. I wanted to be prudent or courageous or act justly because justice is an end. If someone say, why should I be just? The question is in some sense silly. It's the silliest saying, why do you want to be physically healthy? Right? So imagine you say, I'm running. You say, why are you running? So, because I want to be healthy. Someone says, why do you want to be healthy? Say, are you nuts? Same thing with courageous. Why are you going to battle and fighting for Rome? Because I want to be courageous. And if you ask, well, why do you want to be courageous? The question would be silly. Epicurus was not into the virtues. The virtues mattered for him only insofar as they brought around tranquility of soul. So to end this, we can say Jefferson's Epicurus, what Epicurus? He had an Epicurus of his own crafting.
Okay. Maybe he took bits and pieces, the parts he.
Yeah, and that's unlike Jefferson. He's usually pretty. So we got about a minute left. You want to bring us home here?
Oh yeah. What is our next episode?
I don't know. We'll have to figure that out. Leave some things hanging. You want to sum up what we've learned here, everything?
Okay.
Or
So
did we
okay.
learn anything?
So did we learn? Yes, we learned that Thomas Jefferson was not an Epicurean. He was a Stoic.
Yeah, I would say he was a Stoic who was very attracted to the teachings of Jesus. His ethical views were a melange, a salmagundi. I don't know what that word is either. It was a mixture, an admixture of Jesus's teachings, benevolence, Stoic virtue ethics, Aristotle virtue ethics, as well as the moral sense theorizing of contemporaries like Adam Smith and Lord Keynes.
Wow.
And my dog is snoring here.
Oh.
Oh. I think we put him to sleep.
Did we put everybody else to sleep?
No, I think this is a good one. I think you asked. Hi, if you would like to get an autographed copy of one of my books, or to have me come to your club, to your place of business, or to your academic institution to speak about that guy, contact me at mholowchak@hotmail.com. That's MHOLOWCHAK at hotmail.com. Thank you.